My name is Nicole Young. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I believed that patience was a quiet virtue that eventually got rewarded. I used to think that if you poured enough love, enough of your own health, and enough silent endurance into a broken foundation, the universe would eventually reward your grace. But life doesn't always work like that, does it? Sometimes, the reward for your silence is just a heavier burden to carry. Grab your coffee, pull up a chair, and let's talk honestly today. If you've ever been the person who blamed themselves for everything that went wrong in a relationship, type the word accountable in the comments right now. I want to see how many of us have carried weights that never belonged to us. For me, the realization that my entire life was a carefully constructed fiction didn't arrive with a loud, dramatic confrontation. It didn't happen with screaming matches or smashed plates. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind of boring, repetitive day that makes up most of a life. I was standing barefoot on my kitchen floor, folding a warm stack of laundry, and lazily wondering what I should make for dinner. It was late fall, and the afternoon light was coming through the window at that sharp, low angle that makes everything look a little lonely. Then, my phone buzzed twice on the counter. My sister Emily's name flashed across the screen. It was a multimedia message, a photograph sent by mistake, meant for someone else entirely. I wiped my hands on my jeans and opened the message without thinking, expecting a picture of a dress she liked or a recipe she wanted to try. But in that single second, looking down at that small, glowing screen, 8 years of my marriage turned into a massive lie I hadn't known I was living. The photograph was crisp and clear. My husband Charles was sitting in a brightly lit room, looking down with a look of pure, unadulterated adoration. In his arms, he was carefully cradling 2 newborn infants, twins. The text caption typed underneath the image, written by my sister, read quite simply, "Daddy loves you both." I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't drop the phone. Instead, I just stood there, completely frozen, as a strange, permanent stillness settled inside my chest. By trade, I am a forensic accountant. That means I spend my 40-hour work weeks hunting down the small, quiet inconsistencies that people think no one else will ever notice. I look for the numbers that don't add up, the transactions that feel out of place, the financial stories that almost make sense, but don't quite cross the line of truth. I have built a highly successful career on trusting hard, cold evidence over volatile human emotion. I just never thought I'd need to use those exact forensic skills on my own husband, in my own home. But as I stared at that photo, the frantic emotional side of my brain turned off completely, and the analytical accountant took over. I wasn't just a betrayed wife looking at her husband's secret family. I was an investigator looking at the very first piece of undeniable evidence. To truly understand the depth of what I was looking at on my phone screen, you have to understand the history of the house we lived in. Charles and I got married when I was 30. Back then, he was ambitious, charming, and possessed the kind of loud, magnetic energy that easily filled up a room without him even trying. He co-owned a growing logistics company, and I loved him deeply. I loved watching him build something substantial from absolute nothing. In those early years, we talked endlessly about the family we were going to create. We argued playfully over names, debated whether we'd raise our kids in the fast-paced city or move out somewhere quieter, and drew up blueprints for a busy, noisy life. It felt inevitable. It felt like a family was something that was simply going to happen to us. The same predictable way that summer naturally follows spring. But it didn't happen, not easily, and not for a very long time. We tried naturally for 2 grueling years before we finally admitted to ourselves that we needed medical help. And that's when our marriage shifted into a relentless cycle of clinical appointments, invasive tests, and a cold, sterile terminology that quickly began to feel like a second language. IUI, IVF, hormone panels, and endless injections. For years, my daily routine revolved around self-administered hormone shots that left painful dark purple bruises all over my stomach. I spent years hiding my changing body under loose, oversized shirts so my coworkers wouldn't ask questions. Worse than the physical pain was the grief. We lost 3 pregnancies before they ever managed to become anything more than a fleeting, flickering heartbeat on a black and white ultrasound screen. Each loss was a private, devastating grief that I carried mostly alone. I say alone because Charles always seemed to recover so much faster than I did. He would pat my shoulder, tell me to stay positive, and head right back to work, while I lay awake at 3 a.m., doing frantic mental math in my head, treating my own life like a broken client file. Where did this go wrong? What did I miss? What could I have done differently? I blamed my own body ruthlessly. I blamed my high-stress job. I blamed a single glass of wine I had enjoyed one evening before I even knew I was pregnant with our first loss. I blamed the universe, my genetics, and my flaws, because the actual truth wasn't something I had access to yet. And through every single tear, Charles would hold my hand in those sterile waiting rooms, looking deeply into my eyes and repeating the exact same phrase like a sacred promise. We'll get through this together. I believed him with every fiber of my being. I believed him the way you believe the sun will rise in the morning, without demanding advanced evidence, without asking questions, simply because the alternative reality was too unthinkable to bear. And then there was my younger sister, Emily. She was 3 years younger, always warm, always seemingly available to drop off a homemade casserole, offer a tight hug, or tell me to call her at any hour of the night. I took her kindness at absolute face value. She used to look at me with wide eyes and say she completely admired my strength, that she honestly didn't know how I managed to keep going after so much heartbreak. Have you ever had someone close to you look at your pain under the guise of admiration, while secretly plotting to take what was yours? If you know that specific flavor of betrayal, type the word facade in the comments. Because looking back at that photo on my kitchen floor, I realized a terrifying psychological truth. Admiration and envy can wear the exact same face, and I had let the wolf right through my front door. When Emily called me almost immediately after sending that photograph, my phone vibrated hard against my palm. I picked up the line, but I didn't say a word. I just let the silence stretch out, heavy and cold. "Nicole," she said, her voice cracking, sounding frantic and breathless. I didn't mean for you to find out like this." I hung up on her. I didn't yell, I didn't demand an explanation, and I didn't ask a single question. I didn't need to. If 8 years of intensive forensic training had taught me anything above all else, it's this. Once you discover the very first inconsistency in a file, you never confront the person who created it. You don't give them a chance to scramble, delete evidence, or construct a more believable lie. Instead, you stay completely silent and you gather everything first. You confirm the exact, full shape of the deception before you ever let them know you've even seen it. So I closed my eyes, took one deep, steadying breath, and opened my laptop right there on the kitchen counter. I looked up the highest-rated family law attorney in our city, a man named Daniel Brooks, and booked the earliest consultation available. 2 days later, I was sitting across from him in a quiet office that smelled faintly of fresh coffee and expensive paper. Without a single tear or a tremor in my hand, I signed the initial paperwork to begin formal divorce proceedings against my husband of 8 years. I remember looking down at my own signature, feeling almost surprised by how steady the ink looked. But signing the papers was just the legal safety net. Now, I needed the full story. I went home that night, made a standard dinner, and sat across from Charles like nothing had happened. Because for the first time in nearly a decade, I understood something with absolute, beautiful clarity. I wasn't the one who needed to explain myself anymore. While my husband was out celebrating the arrival of 2 secret children with my sister, fully believing I was completely oblivious, I was already 3 steps ahead of them both. The next morning, the moment Charles left for what he called a routine business trip that would keep him out of town for a few days, I got to work. My career has proven to me time and time again that people who are entirely confident they'll never get caught leave the absolute messiest trails. They stop being careful because they've successfully convinced themselves that they are smarter than everyone else in the room. Charles had spent 8 long years meticulously building his reputation as a deeply devoted, grieving husband who was struggling through infertility right alongside me. That kind of elaborate narrative requires constant, exhausting maintenance, and people who are too busy maintaining a grand public story rarely notice the tiny pieces of factual evidence they are leaving behind in the real world. I started my investigation with our financial history. We had always kept mostly separate bank accounts, a choice that had felt merely practical at the time, but now felt entirely prophetic. However, we did share a single joint account that we used exclusively for community household expenses. I opened the PDF statements for the past 2 years, blew up the font size, and began a line-by-line audit. Buried deep between ordinary grocery runs, local utility payments, and home repair costs, my eyes locked onto 4 separate, recurring charges to a specific boutique hotel in a sleepy suburb neither of us had any logical reason to visit. 2 nights each time, always a Thursday checkout into a Friday morning. I opened the digital calendar on my laptop and began cross-referencing those exact hotel dates against my own history. I tracked the location history logged automatically on my phone, a feature I had honestly forgotten I even had turned on. And as the dates lined up on my screen, a sickening wave of clarity washed over me. 3 of those exact hotel charges matched up perfectly with the specific weeks I was home alone, heavily sedated and painfully recovering from invasive IVF embryo transfers. Those were the exact weeks Charles had looked at me with a sad, stressed expression and told me he needed to clear his heavy head by staying late at the logistics office. He wasn't working late to pay for our future family. He was paying for a room to destroy it. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open until nearly 2 in the morning, the blue light reflecting off my face in the dark. Piece by piece, transaction by transaction, the last 3 years of my marriage systematically rearranged themselves into a horrifying blueprint I barely recognized. If you've ever had that sudden, chilling moment where your past completely rewrites itself before your eyes, type the word clarity in the comments below. It's a heavy feeling, isn't it? As I dug deeper, memories of my sister Emily kept flashing through my mind, but now they were stripped of their innocent context. She had told me more than once that she was simply trying to ease my burden by driving Charles to his various appointments when my demanding work schedule wouldn't allow it. "I'm just helping out, Nicole," she used to say with that sweet, airy smile, acting as if it cost her nothing. But my audit told a completely different story. I found digital toll records and gas station receipts, showing that those supposed medical appointments often happened on specific days when Charles had no doctor visits scheduled at all. Then came the biggest oversight they made, the digital paper trail they completely forgot to wipe clean. Years ago, when Charles and I first bought our house, we had set up a shared cloud storage folder for joint family photos. Over time, as our relationship grew strained through the infertility struggles, we stopped using it, and it faded into the background of our digital lives. Charles clearly assumed I had deleted the app or deactivated my access. He was wrong. I logged into the old server, and my breath caught in my throat. There were photos spanning back nearly 3 consecutive years. There was a photo of Emily at his office holiday party, standing just a fraction of an inch too close, her hand resting flat against his jacket in a way that screamed intimacy. There were timestamps from a weekend getaway, logged in our calendar under a critical business trip. But the background of the image featured a sun-drenched beach that was nowhere near any client site his logistics company managed. They hadn't been incredibly careless. They had simply lived under the arrogant assumption that I would never have a reason to look. I want to be completely honest with you all about something. There is a very particular, sharp kind of pain that comes from confirming a betrayal you already strongly suspect. It is fundamentally different from the sudden shock of discovering a lie you never saw coming. This was the second kind. It wasn't a slow burn. It was an absolute demolition of my reality. Yet, underneath the initial heartbreak, something incredibly cold and solid began to take shape inside me. Pure, unadulterated focus. For 8 long years, I had absorbed every single difficult moment, every failed procedure, and every negative pregnancy test of our marriage as my own personal, biological failure. I believed it was my body, my fault, and my heavy burden to fix. Now, looking at the metadata on my screen, I finally understood the psychological truth. I had been carrying the crushing weight of someone else's choices the entire time. I didn't let my anger dictate my next move. I didn't text Charles a furious paragraph, and I didn't call Emily back to scream at her. Instead, I did exactly what I do best for my clients. I built a bulletproof forensic file. Every single hotel charge, every mismatched alibi, every photo with an undeniable digital timestamp that told a truer story than either of them had ever uttered out loud. I organized it all methodically, without a single line of personal commentary. The raw facts didn't need my anger attached to them to be devastating. They spoke clearly enough entirely on their own. I encrypted the entire file and sent it directly to my attorney, Daniel Brooks, 2 days later. He read through the documentation right in front of me during our second formal meeting, his face entirely unreadable in the practiced, steady way of a seasoned lawyer who has seen every tragic version of heartbreak a broken marriage can possibly produce. When he finally closed the laptop, he looked up at me, adjusted his glasses, and simply said, "Nicole, this is incredibly thorough." I looked him dead in the eye, adjusted my posture, and replied, "I've had 8 years of practice noticing the small details that other people think they missed." He didn't ask me to elaborate on that, and I didn't offer to explain. We both knew the battle lines had been drawn, and I was completely prepared to win. It was exactly 3 days after that second intense meeting with my attorney when my phone rang with a phone number I recognized instantly, but had not expected to see at all. Margaret, Charles's mother. We had always shared an incredibly warm relationship over the years, the kind of bond built on genuine, deep affection rather than a rigid sense of family obligation. She used to call me just to check in on my week, to ask how my accounting work was going, or to tell me all about the new roses blooming in her backyard garden. But this specific call felt radically different from the very moment I pressed answer. Her voice was incredibly thin, unsteady, and fragile, in a way I had never once heard from her in the 8 years I had known her. "Nicole," she said, and then she immediately went completely silent for a long, painful moment. There was just the heavy, ragged sound of her breathing on the other end of the line. When she finally found the strength to speak again, she was crying openly, trying and completely failing to keep her voice even. "Please," she whispered desperately, "don't tell him yet." I stood perfectly still in my kitchen, the exact same kitchen where I'd seen that devastating photograph of the twins just over a week earlier, and I felt the emotional ground shift beneath me once again. "Don't tell him what, Margaret?" I asked, my voice remaining entirely level, my analytical mind instantly firing up. She didn't answer my direct question. She just kept repeating those exact 4 words over and over again like a frantic mantra, like they were the only fragile thing holding her together. "Don't tell him yet. Don't tell him yet." I realized right then, standing there listening to my mother-in-law completely fall apart on the phone, that I had uncovered a standard marital affair. But somehow, impossibly, I had a growing, sinking psychological sense that I had not yet uncovered the real truth of my life. Have you ever had a moment where you realized the lie you found was just the outer wrapper of a much bigger, much older secret? If you've ever had to brace yourself for a truth you didn't see coming, type the word layers in the comments right now. I agreed to meet Margaret 2 days later at a small, quiet coffee shop located exactly halfway between our houses. It was a familiar, cozy place where we'd been together a dozen times before over the years, always for easy, comfortable conversations about life. This time, however, she was already seated in a corner booth long before I arrived. Her hands were wrapped so incredibly tightly around her warm coffee cup that her knuckles had gone completely pale, and she didn't even look up until I pulled out the heavy wooden chair directly across from her. She looked a decade older than I remembered. It wasn't just a physical change in years. It was something much heavier, a profound, exhausting kind of tired that comes from carrying a massive emotional weight for far too long without ever setting it down. Margaret had always been an incredibly composed, elegant woman, the sort of traditional person who ironed her linen napkins and never once raised her voice, even during intense family arguments. But the woman sitting across from me now looked utterly broken, like she hadn't slept a single wink in days. "I need you to understand something, Nicole," she said urgently, before I had even taken off my winter coat or sat all the way down. "What I'm about to tell you, I should have said it 8 long years ago. I've regretted my silence every single day since then." I didn't say a single word in response. I just sat down and looked at her. In my line of work as an auditor, I've learned that heavy silence is often the absolute fastest way to get someone to keep talking. When you don't fill the void with your own words, the other person's anxiety will compel them to fill it for you. So I waited, watching her pale knuckles grip the ceramic cup, waiting for the real data to finally drop. Margaret took a slow, shuddering breath and told me that she had known something massive, something fundamental, that would have entirely changed the trajectory of my life since almost the very beginning of my marriage. She said it in fractured pieces, circling the core information the way people naturally do when they are absolutely terrified that saying it plainly will make it permanently, irreversibly real. As she stammered, a cold dread began to pool in my stomach. I cut through her trembling words. "Does Emily know?" I asked, because that was the singular question sitting heaviest on my chest. If my own sister had known some deep secret about my marriage for years and kept it hidden while sleeping with my husband, I wasn't sure I'd survive the sheer psychological horror of that answer. Margaret shook her head firmly, her eyes wide. "No, Emily doesn't know any of this. Neither does Charles." Her eyes locked onto mine, and there was an agonizing, pleading look in them. "Only me and one other person. Dr. Collins, your old fertility doctor." I felt my stomach tighten into a hard knot. Dr. Rebecca Collins had overseen nearly every single agonizing stage of our fertility treatments 8 years ago. She was the one who ran the tests, scheduled the invasive procedures, and sat us down for countless conversations about the mathematical odds, options, and what heartbreaking step might come next. I hadn't spoken a single word to her in years, not since Charles and I had finally stopped all treatments, surrendered to the reality of our empty house, and tried to make peace with the quiet life we had instead of the loud one we had planned. "What does Dr. Collins have to do with this, Margaret?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave, steadying itself against the rising tide of confusion. Margaret's hands trembled so violently that a few drops of coffee splashed over the rim of her cup onto the wooden table. "There was a medical report," she whispered, her voice dropping so low I had to lean across the table to hear her. "Results from a specialized testing panel, back when you two were still trying everything you humanly could. I saw it before Charles did. I wasn't supposed to, Nicole. It came to my house by mistake, addressed to him, and I opened it without thinking, the way you do with mail that looks entirely routine." She paused, a tear spilling over her wrinkled cheek. "It wasn't routine. I read it, and I understood immediately that if Charles saw it, it would break something fundamental in him that I didn't think could ever be repaired. So I made a terrible decision. I called Dr. Collins directly, and I begged her, mother to mother, to let me handle it in my own way, in my own time. She agreed, entirely against her better medical judgment, because she'd known our family for a decade, and she trusted me to do right by everyone." Margaret looked down at her pale knuckles, completely unable to meet my gaze. I never did right by anyone, Nicole. I just delayed the pain, and I let it grow in the dark into something much, much bigger. I sat perfectly still, processing the data. I thought about all the pieces I'd already painstakingly gathered. The hotel receipts, the fraudulent business trips, the photographs that told a truer story than either Charles or Emily ever had. I had walked into this coffee shop entirely convinced that I understood the full, tragic shape of my marriage's collapse. But sitting across from Margaret, listening to her ragged breathing, I realized I'd only been looking at the surface of a deception that was much older, much deeper, and much stranger than a standard modern affair. "Margaret," I said, my voice cutting through her soft sobs like a forensic blade, "what did that report say?" With shaking hands, she reached deep into her leather purse and pulled out a small, worn slip of paper. "It wasn't the actual official report itself," she explained, "but a private note she had frantically written to herself the exact day she read it. Something to help her remember the precise medical terminology in case she ever found the courage to bring it forward. She didn't hand it to me across the table. She just clutched it tightly against her chest, as if it were a live grenade too dangerous to release into the world just yet. "I can't tell you here," she whispered, looking around the busy coffee shop. "Not like this, not in pieces. You deserve to see the real file properly, the way I should have shown Charles 8 years ago, instead of hiding it in a drawer and telling myself I was protecting him." Her voice caught in a heavy sob. "I wasn't protecting him, Nicole. I was protecting myself from watching my son fall apart, from being the one who broke him." I reached across the sticky table and covered her cold, trembling hand with mine. It was an analytical instinct I couldn't entirely explain, given everything I now knew she'd withheld from me. But whatever lie she was carrying, it had clearly cost her nearly a decade of her own peace. "I need to see that file, Margaret," I told her, my voice firm and unyielding. "The real one, wherever Dr. Collins keeps her permanent records." Margaret nodded slowly, using the back of her free hand to wipe her eyes. Then she leaned in and said something that stayed with me for the rest of that day, replaying itself over and over like a broken record as I drove home through streets that suddenly felt completely unfamiliar. "Those babies changed everything, Nicole," she whispered, her voice chillingly quiet, "but not for the reason Charles thinks they did." I called Dr. Rebecca Collins's medical office the very next morning, before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. I hadn't spoken a single word to her in nearly 5 long years, not since that final, devastatingly failed round of treatment when Charles and I had quietly agreed to stop trying and let ourselves grieve the family we were never going to have. Her receptionist put me through to her private line much faster than I expected, and when Dr. Collins finally picked up, her voice carried an immediate note of surprise that quickly shifted into something far more guarded, far more careful. "Nicole," she said, her tone measuring each syllable, "it's been a very long time." "I need to see my old medical file," I told her, skipping any polite pleasantries, letting my forensic training dictate my cold efficiency. "All of it, Dr. Collins. Every single test, every lab result, and every piece of correspondence from the years we were doing fertility treatments together." There was a heavy, agonizingly long pause on the line, long enough that I could hear the faint, low hum of the busy clinic infrastructure in the background. "Can I ask what exactly has brought this on after all these years?" she asked quietly. "Margaret came to see me," I said simply, letting the name drop like a lead weight. Another pause followed, much shorter this time, heavy with a decade of professional regret. "Come in this afternoon," Dr. Collins said, her voice sighing. "I'll pull the physical folder from the archives myself." The fertility clinic looked almost exactly as it had 5 years ago, when I used to frequent it with a heart full of desperate hope. It had the same soft, muted gray walls, the same sterile watercolor prints hanging in the hallways, all explicitly designed to make devastating, life-altering news feel somehow gentler than it actually was. But I wasn't that fragile, self-blaming woman anymore. Dr. Collins met me in her private office rather than a cold examination room, a thick, yellowed paper folder already waiting under her hands on the mahogany desk. She was in her late 50s now, with prominent silver threading through hair that had been mostly dark the last time I'd sat across from her. Yet, her professional manner remained exactly the same, measured, clinical, and completely unwilling to soften harsh facts into something comfortable. "Before I open this and show you what's inside, Nicole," she began, looking at me with absolute sincerity, "I want you to know that I have deeply regretted my part in this narrative. For 8 long years, Margaret came to me in a moment of profound, frantic maternal distress, and I made a terrible medical choice that I would never make again. I let a mother's desperate fear override a patient's absolute right to their own diagnostic results." She took a breath and slid the heavy folder across the smooth desk toward me. "I am sorry, Nicole, truly." I pulled the folder toward me and opened it with hands that were remarkably, beautifully steady, given what I already suspected I might find inside. The first few dozen pages were entirely familiar to me: hormone panels, uterine lining checks, ultrasound notes, the grueling clinical shorthand of 8 years of trying to force a child into existence. But near the very back of the file, stapled separately, there was a specific laboratory report I had never seen in my entire life. It was dated almost exactly 8 years earlier, addressed explicitly and exclusively to Charles, never to me. If you have ever been gaslit into believing you were the root cause of a broken dream, type the word "validated" in the comments section below. Because what I read next altered the gravity of my past forever. I scanned the dense medical terminology, slowly and methodically translating the clinical language in my head, the exact same way I'd spend hours translating complex financial statements for confused auditing clients, until the core meaning became completely, undeniably unmistakable. The catastrophic reproductive results weren't about my body at all. They were about Charles. The lab report showed clearly, clinically, and with zero mathematical ambiguity, that the severe reproductive difficulties we had faced for nearly a decade had originated entirely with his biology, a severe male factor finding. It was so significant that Dr. Collins had recommended, in explicit writing, that we completely halt standard procedures and discuss alternative biological paths forward together as a married couple. That critical letter had been sent home in an envelope addressed directly to Charles. Margaret had intercepted and opened it by mistake, and instead of handing the truth to her son, she had made a unilateral decision, alone in a moment of absolute panic, to protect him from a reality she fiercely believed he could not psychologically survive. I sat back in that quiet, gray office and felt 8 years of agonizing self-blame, psychological torment, and deep physical trauma instantly rearrange themselves into something entirely different. Every single late night I'd spent doing frantic mental math on what I might have done wrong. Every invasive, agonizing medical procedure I'd endured believing my own flawed body was the sole reason we were suffering. Every tearful apology I'd ever whispered to Charles in the pitch black of our bedroom, begging him to forgive me for not giving him the family he wanted, none of it had ever belonged to me in the first place. I wasn't broken. I had just been lied to. I looked up from the stark white pages, my eyes tracking the sterile gray lines of the office. Why didn't she ever tell him? I asked, my voice hollow, though a forensic psychologist could have already parsed out the structural architecture of the cover-up. Fear, I think, Dr. Collins said, her voice dropping into a gentle, heavy register. Margaret loved her son fiercely, Nicole, but it was the kind of toxic maternal love where protecting his ego and his immediate happiness mattered far more than the objective truth. She convinced herself that if he never discovered his own biological limitations, it would never have to hurt him. I don't think she ever once considered what that silence would eventually cost you, both physically and mentally. I didn't answer her. My mind, trained to connect disparate financial data points, was already racing past the trauma of the past 8 years, and landing squarely on the present timeline. I thought about my sister Emily. I thought about that crisp, brightly lit photograph of Charles holding two newborn infants in his arms, with a caption calling him Daddy, without a single shred of hesitation or doubt. If this medical report currently sitting on my lap was accurate, and looking at the certified laboratory stamps, I had absolutely no logical reason left to doubt its validity, then those children biologically could not be his. The severe, unresolved male factor condition that had made natural conception entirely impossible with me for 8 long years would have made it just as impossible with her, which meant a completely different, double-layered deception was unfolding. Either Emily was entirely oblivious to the truth of her own children's biology, or she knew exactly what she was doing, and she was spinning an even more complex web of lies than a standard marital affair. Charles had destroyed our marriage to claim a family that didn't even belong to him. If you can see the absolute poetic irony of this trap snapping shut, type the word karma in the comments right now. I didn't share any of these analytical deductions out loud with Dr. Collins. I simply closed the file, adjusted my posture, and asked her for official, certified copies of every single document in the folder. She made them for me immediately without a single word of hesitation, sliding the crisp, fresh pages across her desk like she was finally, after 8 long years of carrying professional guilt, allowed to do her job the way she should have from the absolute start. I didn't confront Charles that afternoon. I didn't call Emily to drop the biological bomb, and I didn't even call Margaret back, though I knew deep down that I owed my mother-in-law some kind of response after the massive secret she had finally unearthed for me. Instead, I drove straight back to my quiet house, parked in the empty driveway, and sat inside my car for a long, silent time. The yellow folder rested heavily on the passenger seat beside me, a physical manifestation of a truth that completely rewrote my past. I thought about every single version of my marriage I had faithfully believed in over the years. The hopeful, naive version in our early 30s, the deeply grieving version after our 3rd pregnancy loss, the shattered, betrayed version I had been surviving for the past 2 weeks. None of them had been the complete, objective truth, and now I was holding the exact piece of data that changed the definition of everything else. When I finally walked inside and called Margaret later that evening, my voice was calm in a way that seemed to genuinely startle her through the phone. "I have the official file, Margaret," I said simply. "I know exactly what it says." She was entirely quiet on the other end of the line for what felt like an eternity. When she finally let out a breath, there was a profound, exhaustion-laced sense of relief threaded through her voice. As if a crushing boulder she had carried alone for nearly a decade had finally been partially rolled away. "Now I finally understand why you looked so terrified, Margaret," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper as I stared out the dark kitchen window. "The exact moment you saw those babies for the very first time." I didn't hear a single word from Charles for almost 2 weeks after I officially filed the divorce paperwork. He was staying entirely with Emily, wherever that was, playing house with 2 infants, while carrying a biological truth he didn't yet understand. I spent those 2 quiet weeks finishing exactly what I had started. I met with my attorney, Daniel Brooks, twice more, systematically organizing our financial assets, freezing joint lines of credit, and moving through the practical, detached motions of ending a marriage. All the while, I was carrying a massive secret that would eventually end their entire world for reasons far different than the simple affair I'd originally discovered. I never once reached out to Emily. I didn't know yet what she truly understood about the timeline, and honestly, looking back, I wasn't sure I even cared to know. Some simple betrayals are easy enough to survive through sheer hot anger. But this one had roots that ran so deep into the soil of my past that I was still trying to fully process the damage myself. Then, Margaret called me on a quiet Thursday evening, her voice tight with an overwhelming mixture of dread and absolute urgency. "Charles is coming home tonight, Nicole," she said, her throat clearing nervously through the receiver. He wants me to meet the babies properly, and he's bringing Emily with him. I understood immediately what that meant, and the immense psychological courage it was going to take from her. Margaret, I told her softly, you don't have to do anything you aren't completely ready for. I've hidden this terrible truth for 8 long years, Nicole, she whispered back, a newfound finality grounding her tone. I think it's finally time I stopped running. I wasn't physically present in the room when it happened, but Margaret recounted the entire confrontation to me afterward in such vivid, meticulous detail that I could see it playing out clearly in my mind, almost as if I had been standing right there in the living room doorway myself. Charles arrived at his mother's house first, letting himself in through the front door with the exact same easy, magnetic confidence he had carried into every single room he'd ever entered in his adult life. It was the unshakable arrogance of a man who had never once in his life questioned whether he truly deserved good things. Emily followed closely behind him, carrying a plastic baby carrier in each hand, her face carefully arranged into a calculated expression sitting somewhere right between a humble apology and deep maternal pride. Margaret told me later that Emily looked utterly exhausted in the very specific way all new mothers do, but she was also lit up from somewhere deep underneath the fatigue. It was the triumphant look of someone who believed they had finally stolen the exact life they had wanted for a very long time. Charles set his travel bag down by the door, turned toward his mother, and flashed an expression Margaret said she knew she would never forget for the rest of her days. It was an open, hopeful, almost boyish smile, the look of a proud man about to hand his mother the absolute greatest news of her life. Mom, he said proudly, gesturing broadly toward the 2 twins Emily was carefully lifting from their car seats. You're finally a grandmother. Margaret told me the entire room went completely, terrifyingly quiet after that single sentence. She looked down at those 2 small, innocent faces, and something inside her psychological armor simply gave out. All the agonizing years of holding this secret in, all the countless sleepless nights spent convincing herself that she was protecting her son's fragile ego by staying silent, collapsed in on themselves the exact instant she saw those babies cradled in her son's arms. She said she felt the blood instantly leave her face, felt her legs go completely unsteady beneath her weight, and had to reach out frantically for the high back of a dining chair just to stay upright. Charles noticed her physical reaction immediately, his broad smile instantly faltering into complete confusion. Mom, what's wrong? She opened her mouth, and the broken words that came out weren't the poetic, rehearsed lines she had practiced 1,000 times over 8 long years. They came out incredibly small, fractured, and trembling, but they were finally, after everything we had been through, completely true. Wait, Margaret whispered, her eyes wide as she stared at the infants. She didn't tell you. Charles went completely still, his posture freezing. Behind him, Emily, who was still holding one of the newborns tightly against her hip, went pale in a sudden, dramatic way that Margaret noticed immediately. It was a visceral, psychological reaction that told Margaret an incredibly important piece of data. Emily didn't know either. Whatever bomb Margaret was about to reveal, it was brand new information to both of them, in different ways and for entirely different reasons. Tell me what? Charles asked, his voice dropping into a dangerous, careful register, the tone of a man who suddenly sensed the entire ground shifting beneath his feet. Margaret didn't answer his question right away. She stood there for a long, agonizing moment, looking back and forth between her son and the sister who had helped him build a secret life, feeling the crushing weight of 8 years of silence pressing down on that single room. She told me she thought about me in that moment. She thought about the years I had spent crying, destroying my health, and blaming my own body for a failure that had never been mine to begin with. And that memory was what finally gave her the courage to move. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked down the hallway into her private study. Charles followed her partway, standing frozen in the doorframe, watching in complete silence as his mother knelt on the closet floor in front of a small, fireproof safe he hadn't even known existed. Her hands were shaking violently as she worked the combination. From deep inside the iron safe, she lifted out a single, sealed envelope that was worn completely soft at the edges from 8 years of being touched, wept over, and hidden away. She carried the envelope back into the living room and placed it flat on the coffee table right between them, withdrawing her trembling fingers as if letting go of the paper required a massive physical effort. "Sit down, Charles," Margaret said, her voice dropping all its warmth. "Please." Charles stood over the table for a moment, bracing his shoulders like a man about to step into freezing water, before slowly sinking into the couch. Emily lowered herself onto the very edge of the armchair across from him, the baby fussing softly against her shoulder in the tense, suffocating silence of the room. Margaret opened the envelope herself, her fingers moving carefully over the yellowed documents. One by one, she laid the contents out on the table, the original laboratory results, the explicit letter from Dr. Collins addressed directly to Charles, and the handwritten note she had penned to herself nearly a decade ago. Charles picked up the medical report first. Margaret watched his eyes sprint across the page, slowly at first, then incredibly fast, then freezing completely as he reread certain lines over and over, trying to force his brain to make sense of a clinical language that was completely rearranging his reality. "This says," he started, his voice cracking before he could finish. He looked up at his mother, his face completely blank with shock. "This is about me." "Yes," Margaret said softly, her tears flowing freely now. "This isn't Nicole's file, Charles. This is yours." "You're telling me." His voice had gone entirely flat, a strange, hollow tone Margaret had never heard from him in his entire life. "You're telling me the reason we couldn't have children. It was never her?" Margaret nodded silently, entirely unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Charles set the paper back down on the table with exaggerated, trembling care, as if his hands had suddenly become completely unreliable. 8 years, he whispered, staring blankly at the wall. 8 years I let her think it was her fault. She used to look at me, Mom. She used to cry and apologize to me in the dark. And I just sat there and let her do it, because I never knew there was any reason to say otherwise. Across the room, Emily had gone completely rigid, the infant now dead silent against her chest. Margaret watched the exact moment the logical puzzle pieces began to arrange themselves behind Emily's eyes. If that medical report was real, if the severe male factor diagnosis from 8 years ago was an unresolved biological fact, then these 2 babies in her arms, conceived during their secret affair, biologically could not carry Charles's blood. The exact same condition that had prevented conception with me made conception with her equally impossible. "Charles," Emily said, her voice dropping into a terrified, breathless whisper as she looked down at the child. "What does this mean?" Charles didn't answer Emily's terrified question. He was still looking directly at his mother, a raw, furious, and shattered storm building rapidly behind his eyes. "You knew," he said, his voice dropping into a register that made the walls feel small. "You've known this for 8 long years, and you just sat there and let me believe." He couldn't even finish the sentence. He stood up abruptly from the sofa, the creased medical report still gripped tightly in his white-knuckled hand, and began pacing the entire length of the living room like a caged animal. He needed his body to move because his mind had completely stopped, being able to hold still under the weight of the data. "I was trying to protect you, Charles," Margaret cried out, her voice breaking completely as she reached toward him. "I know that's not a valid excuse. I know what it has cost you both, and I have hated my own reflection every single day since I made that choice." "Protect me from what?" Charles's voice exploded, rising to a shout for the very first time. "From the truth? From a piece of paper? Mom, you let me watch my wife blame herself for nearly a decade. You let me watch her go through painful procedures, through devastating losses, through absolutely everything, thinking it was her body failing us, when the whole time. He stopped dead in his tracks, pressing the heel of his palm hard against his forehead, as if he were physically trying to hold his fracturing thoughts together. Emily stood up slowly from her chair, shifting the heavy baby onto her hip, her face completely drained of color. "Charles," she whispered, her voice trembling with a fear that had absolutely nothing to do with standard judgment and everything to do with raw, psychological horror. "I need you to look at this with me. If what this report says is true, then these babies. Who?" She couldn't finish the sentence either. The living room fell into a suffocating silence, heavier than anything that had come before it. Margaret told me that Charles finally turned his head to look at Emily, and in that single second, a cold, unspoken understanding passed between them. It had absolutely nothing to do with love, and everything to do with the sudden, terrifying realization that whatever secret life they had built together over the past 3 years had been built on the exact same broken foundation as the marriage he had just destroyed. The affair, the deep betrayal, the secrecy, the children he had been so immensely proud to introduce as his own biological legacy less than 10 minutes earlier. None of it meant what he had believed it meant. Walking through that front door, he had thought he was a triumphant father. Now, looking at the laboratory results scattered across the coffee table, at his weeping mother, and at Emily holding a child that could not possibly carry his blood, his entire identity collapsed from the inside out. "I need to see Nicole," he said finally, his voice sounding completely hollow, detached, and empty. "Charles, wait," Margaret started, reaching out a hand. "Maybe you should sit with this information first. Give yourself some time to." But he was already moving. He snatched his keys off the entry table, pulled the heavy front door open, and ran out before anyone could stop his exit. Margaret called after him once, his name catching painfully in her throat, but he didn't even turn around to look back. She stood in the open doorway and watched his car pull out of the driveway far too fast, his red taillights quickly disappearing down the dark street into the pitch black of the night. What Charles didn't understand yet, as he drove frantically toward my house with 8 years of buried lies cracking open behind him, was a fundamental truth about boundaries. Some doors, once they have been closed all the way, don't open up again just because someone finally understands why they should have stayed shut in the first place. He showed up on my front porch a little bit after 9 p.m. I was standing in the living room, and I watched his bright headlights sweep across the wall before I even heard his car door slam shut. I knew with a strange, beautiful kind of internal calm exactly what this unannounced visit was about. I didn't rush to the door. I didn't panic. I slowly finished folding the white towel I was holding, set it down neatly on the counter, and walked over to the entryway at my own deliberate pace. When I pulled back the door, he looked completely undone, a radical departure from the confident, magnetic man I had been married to for 8 years. His collar was completely askew, his hair was messy, and his eyes were bloodshot and red-rimmed from crying hard during the entire drive over. He was still clutching that medical report in his right hand, the paper heavily creased and crumpled from being gripped too tightly. "You knew," he said instantly before I could even open the screen door fully. "Nicole, you knew, didn't you? About the report. About." He held the crumpled paper up between us, like evidence, desperately needing me to confirm a reality he was entirely drowning in. "I found out 2 weeks ago, Charles," I said, my voice completely steady, matching the chill of the autumn night air. "The exact same way I found out about your affair with Emily, by complete accident." He flinched visibly at the sound of her name. "Nicole, I swear to you on everything I own, I had absolutely no idea about any of this," he stammered, his eyes pleading. "I know," I replied calmly, "and I mean it." That was the strangest psychological part of the entire evening. Standing there on my own porch, looking at the absolute wreckage of a man who had just discovered that nearly a decade of crushing guilt he had allowed me to carry alone had never belonged to me, I didn't feel a surge of malicious joy. I felt something much closer to profound sorrow for him than anger. It wasn't nearly enough sorrow to make me change my mind about the divorce, of course. It was just enough to remind me that he, too, had been living inside a deceptive prison someone else constructed, even if he had chosen to build plenty of his own malicious lies right on top of it. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice cracking as he looked past me into our old living room. "Please, Nicole, I just desperately need to talk to you." I stepped back and let him inside. I didn't do it because I owed him an ounce of closure or conversation. I let him in explicitly because I wanted this final interaction to happen entirely on my terms, in my own space, where I possessed the absolute power to end it the exact second I chose to. We sat down in the living room, the exact space where we'd spent 8 years of shared holidays, birthday celebrations, and quiet evening routines. He began to pour his heart out, talking incredibly fast, completely unraveled, as he recounted every detail of the evening. He explained how his mother had forced him to read the file, how Emily had gone completely pale as she realized the twins couldn't biologically be his, and how the secret life he had constructed with such reckless confidence had entirely crumbled to pieces in a matter of 10 minutes. He was talking with a frantic, breathless desperation, clearly hoping that if he explained his pain fast enough, I might magically reconsider the papers currently sitting on Daniel Brooks's desk. "I'm not asking you to forgive Emily," he stammered, his hands shaking as he looked at me. "I'm not even asking you to forgive me right now for the affair. I know that what I did is completely inexcusable. But Nicole, please, you have to see. If I had just known the truth 8 years ago, if my mother hadn't hidden that report from me, none of this would have ever happened. This entire tragedy started with a lie that wasn't mine to carry." I sat quietly and let him finish his entire speech. My career auditing fraudulent files had taught me that if you simply let a person talk without interrupting them, they will eventually reveal exactly who they are. They will talk themselves all the way to the end of their logic until the truth becomes impossible to hide. "You're right about one thing, Charles," I said finally, my voice breaking the silence with a calm, steady rhythm. "The original lie wasn't yours. Your mother made a terrible choice, and she is going to carry the weight of that choice for the rest of her life. Honestly, I think she already understands that damage far better than either of us could ever explain it to her. But you are completely wrong about everything else." I paused, letting the silence settle between us before continuing. "This didn't start with your mother's hidden envelope, Charles. It started the exact day you decided that whatever you felt was missing in our home, you were entitled to go behind my back and find it with my sister, without ever once having the courage to tell me you were struggling. I didn't know how to say it to you," he whispered, looking down at his shoes. "You were already carrying so much grief from the losses." "So you decided to let me carry more?" I asked, my voice cutting through his excuse like a knife. "You let me believe my body was a failure for 8 long years, while you quietly built a separate family with my sister. A medical report doesn't undo that choice, Charles. It explains a small part of our history, but it doesn't erase the absolute betrayal you chose to commit in response to it." He didn't have a single counter-argument left. I watched the last bit of fight completely drain from his face as he finally accepted the reality of what I was saying. The elaborate defense he had built up in his mind during the panicked drive over completely dissolved the moment it encountered the objective facts. "What happens to us now?" he asked, his voice sounding smaller than I had ever heard it since the day we met. "Now, the divorce moves forward exactly as planned," I said, my voice completely firm. "Nothing that happened tonight changes the legal reality of what you did." He nodded slowly, staring blankly down at his hands, his fingers tightly wrinkling the edges of the medical report. "And what about Emily?" "She isn't my concern anymore," I answered plainly. And as I said those words out loud, I realized they were entirely true. Somewhere between auditing the fraudulent hotel receipts, listening to Margaret's weeping confession, and reading the cold, clinical language of that old medical file, I had completely stopped needing to know what happened to my sister. Whatever broken reality she and Charles had constructed together, they would have to figure out how to navigate it on their own, completely without me as an audience. Charles finally left my house a little bit before midnight. I stood quietly at the front window, watching his red taillights slowly disappear down the dark street. And for the first time in 2 weeks, I felt something beautiful settle inside my chest instead of tightening. For 8 long years, I had measured my entire self-worth against a tragic story that was never fundamentally true. I understood now that the ending of my marriage had never really been about a single photograph, a modern betrayal, or even a secret buried deep inside a medical archive. It was about the exact moment I stopped waiting for someone else to tell me the truth and finally went out and found it myself. Our final divorce mediation was officially scheduled for a Thursday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Charles had sat in my living room, reading the truth. I remember dressing for the courthouse that morning with immense care, choosing something simple, composed, and professional. I didn't want a single detail to suggest I had spent an extra second worrying about how I would appear to him. I wasn't performing a show of strength anymore. By that point, the strength was simply woven into who I was. Daniel Brooks met me right outside the courthouse doors a few minutes early to run through our final logistics. There wasn't much left to debate. Our financial disclosures were completely thorough, and the asset division terms were entirely fair, if not slightly generous toward Charles, given the clear paper trail I had established. I didn't feel any need to punish him through the bank accounts. The objective truth had already done far more damage to his life than any financial settlement ever could. Charles was already waiting inside the conference room alongside his attorney. He looked visibly smaller, completely diminished compared to the confident man I had married years ago. The past 3 weeks had taken an immense toll on him. His mother's secret hadn't just cost him 8 years of misplaced guilt. It had entirely dismantled the relationship he had built to replace our marriage in the first place. I had heard secondhand through a mutual acquaintance that Emily had already quietly packed up her things and moved entirely out of state with the twins, completely unwilling to remain in a town where every street corner reminded her that her new family was built on an absolute lie. Charles hadn't fought to stop her from leaving, and some part of me understood why. Some structures, once they crack completely through the foundation, simply aren't worth the emotional effort of pretending they can be repaired. Right before the formal legal proceedings began, Charles looked across the long mahogany table and tried one last time. "Nicole," he said, his voice dropping to a quiet whisper. "I know I don't have any right to ask this, but is there any possible version of our story where we can try again?" I looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and I felt a wave of calm wash over me. I didn't feel anger, and I didn't feel sadness. I just felt a deep, immovable sense of finality, the exact feeling you get when you turn to the very last page of a long book, and you already know precisely how the story has to end. "There isn't, Charles," I said softly. "Not because I can't find a way to forgive you in time. I think eventually I probably will. But I need you to understand that forgiveness was never going to be the same thing as staying." He didn't argue with me. He just nodded slowly, his shoulders relaxing slightly, as if a part of his mind had been waiting to hear that exact boundary, even while another part had hoped for a different answer. The rest of the proceedings moved forward with incredible speed. Daniel had prepared our documents flawlessly, leaving absolutely nothing left to contest. When the final signatures were officially placed on the paper and the documents were filed, I walked out of the courthouse into the bright, late morning light, feeling entirely unaccountable to anyone else's version of my life for the first time in 8 years. Margaret called me that evening. She didn't ask for forgiveness outright, and I respected her for that. I think she understood better than most that forgiveness isn't a transaction you can request and receive on the exact same day. It's a slow, messy process of rebuilding trust from the ashes. She simply told me she was immensely proud of how I'd handled the entire situation, and she whispered that she hoped, someday, we might still find a way to know each other even without Charles standing between us. I told her I'd truly like that, and I meant it. Margaret's long silence had cost all of us incredibly dearly, but I had watched her spend the last month doing everything in her limited power to finally make it right. That genuine effort mattered to me more than she probably realized. I never saw Charles again after that courthouse day. Not really. There was only a brief, strictly business-like exchange of emails months later over a forgotten piece of community paperwork, but neither of us wanted to deal with anything more. I heard eventually, through the grapevine, that he'd sold his remaining share of the logistics company and packed his bags for a completely different city, trying, I assume, to build a brand new life far enough away from the old one that had fallen apart so completely in front of everyone he loved. As for me, I didn't spend a single second trying to rebuild my life around what I'd lost. Instead, I built it entirely around what I'd learned. A year after the divorce was finalized, I used a substantial portion of the financial settlement to start a small, nonprofit foundation. It's an organization explicitly designed to help couples navigate complex infertility treatments with total, uncompromised medical transparency, full access to their own diagnostic laboratory results, and real psychological support. It ensures that no one is ever left carrying a mountain of internalized blame that was never theirs to carry in the first place. I named it after no one in particular. It didn't need my specific name or story attached to it to matter to the world. It just needed to exist. I think about those 8 years often. I don't look back at them with bitterness or anger anymore, but rather with a strange, beautiful kind of gratitude for the resilient woman they eventually forced me to become. I spent nearly a decade believing I had failed at the one thing I wanted most in this life. I know now with absolute clarity that I never failed at anything at all. I simply trusted people who weren't honest enough or strong enough to deserve my trust. For 8 long years, I blamed myself. I won't waste another single day doing that. Sometimes, the greatest revenge in this world isn't making someone else suffer the way they made you suffer. It's simply refusing to carry their lies a single step longer. If you've made it this far with me tonight, thank you for sitting down and sharing this space with me. I want to know what you think happens to Nicole next in her journey. Do you think she ever lets someone new and honest into her life? Or do you think she's found absolutely everything she needs entirely on her own? Type your thoughts in the comments below, and please let me know exactly where you're watching from tonight. I love reading your insights and hearing from all of you. We have so many more deep, calm stories, just like this one, waiting for you on the channel, so please make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss a moment. Let's keep this journey going together. Have a beautiful, peaceful night.